I'm Al Roberts. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, also the instructor for SPP 181, Political Science 181, Controversies in Public Policy. And this is a recording of my conversation with my colleague, Professor Ethan Zuckerman, on problems in public deliberation that was recorded for class on September 2nd, 2020. And Professor Zuckerman is an accomplished scholar and public commentator on public affairs. We're very pleased to have him joining the UMass faculty this year. Among his achievements, he's the author of a new book called Mistrust: Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. And that book is going to be published by Norton in January 2021. It's now available for pre-order on Amazon. So I asked Professor Zuckerman to think about three framing questions. The first is how the media or information environment has changed over the last few decades. The second question is addressing the student assignment for this week, and that is how technological advances of the last 20 years have either improved or damaged the public's ability to deliberate effectively about public policy. There's also the possibility that I've simply framed that question inaccurately. And third, we want to think about what, if anything, we ought to do if we think there is a problem with the corrosion of public discourse. Uh, is some form of government response appropriate, or what other response would be appropriate to improve public deliberation? Now, because I'm a rookie in using Zoom, I forgot to press record exactly at the start of the presentation, so the first 30 or 40 seconds of the presentation are missing, and we move directly into Professor Zuckerman addressing the first of the three questions that I posed. Sorry about that.
Mistrust is kind of the dominant factor in contemporary politics. You've seen President Trump urging you not to trust anybody. You've seen people on the American left losing trust in all sorts of institutions. The New York Times had an opinion piece recently saying now you can't even trust the Centers for Disease Control. This increase in mistrust has actually been going on for more than 40 years. It starts during the Nixon administration. The moment at which Americans are most trusting is the 1960s, middle of the 1960s. And since then, there's been this pretty steady, slow drop in trust. So in one sense, you might think maybe this is the internet, right? We can all look up our own facts. We can all create our own content. We can create lots of mis and disinformation. But in a funny way, the timelines don't really line up. The internet isn't really a force in widespread public life until about 2000, right? So for a lot of you, it's been with you all your lives. But there's a good 30 years before that where there's this sort of political change from a fairly trusting populace to a mistrustful populace. What the internet does in some ways is it really radically democratizes who gets a chance to speak. And in that sense, what it does is it starts really transforming a lot of the media institutions we have. And that's a place where I do think it's really worth looking in some detail and kind of understanding what's going on. So I'm going to share my screen just for a moment and kind of talk about a model that I often use for folks to understand this. You just give me a thumbs up if you see a slide that says production, distribution, audience. Awesome. Okay. So this is sort of what media looks like for most of the 20th century. You have someone, maybe it's a newspaper, maybe it's a broadcast television station, and they are producing the news. They've got a newsroom, they've got people going out there and finding stories. They also have a distribution mechanism. For a newspaper, this is usually the basement of the plant, right? The newsroom's on the top floor. The basement has the giant printing presses and sorting machines and tries to figure out how to get the print out to the right people in the right neighborhoods. For television, it's the broadcast tower, right? They control those distribution systems. And what it means is by putting together production and distribution, they're handing information out to audiences. Now, why do we even care about this? We care about this because there's things that we want audiences to do. Our audiences for news are citizens, right? They're people who can vote, they can march, they can protest, they can revolt, they can boycott. We care about news because it's potentially mobilizing people to go out and do things. And right now, in the 20th century, controlling production and distribution is incredibly powerful. The shift that I think happens around 2000 is that the model starts looking something more like this. And it's a model with a bunch of feedback loops within it. So you still have television news providers, you still have newspapers producing content, but you also have bloggers. You also have pretty much anyone who's using social media. Whether you think about it or not, if you're using Instagram, you're using Snapchat, you're using TikTok, you're a media producer and you're part of that production side of the equation. And now everybody is looking at this question of distribution and discovery, which frankly is a little different from how it used to work. It's great that the newspaper still has a printing press, but that's not how most people are seeing this information anymore. They're actually finding it through Facebook. They're finding it through a Google search. They're finding it through algorithmic recommendation on YouTube. So that whole power of distribution has turned into discovery systems instead. There's so much information out here. It's a huge transformation from information being scarce to information being really plentiful. And so now how you discover the information, what gets recommended to you, what comes up in a search result, that's the really big thing that happens. What that means is that the people who are powerful now are the people who run those tools. Google, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. We're still influencing citizens, but they've got a whole bunch of new powers. So one thing that can happen is that citizens are able to amplify content. You see something, you think it's really important, you share it with all of your friends, that's a way for things to go viral. And I would argue that that's a new form of political power, is to try to figure out how to amplify content that you care about, how to combat content that you don't care about. The other thing that happens is that citizens can still produce content. So you can react to content by producing your own content and putting it out there. It's not just the newspapers anymore. This all matters because you still have that option for citizens to go out and influence action. They can protest, they can march, they can vote, et cetera, et cetera. The trick with all of this is this may not be really good for us. There's a lot of people who are starting to wonder whether this model of amplification, of trying to compete for things to go viral, is this addictive? Anyone who feels like they've spent too much time on social media kind of knows that feeling. There's a guy out there named Tristan Harris who believes that we actually need to think about spending our time better. He believes that tools like Facebook actually use a lot of techniques from things like stage magic, as well as from the design of gambling machines to try to keep our time on these systems. Another problem is that this is killing journalism as we know it. So while it's amazing that more people can create content, and really important, right? I don't want to roll back to the 1950s where the only people who are on TV look like me and Al, right? They're white dudes, middle-aged white dudes. And that, for much of the 20th century, was the sort of dominant power of who got to tell you what was news and what was worth paying attention to. At the same time, journalism continues to be incredibly important. We need it to hold institutions responsible. And right now, they've lost much of their business model. They were able to add advertising to the distribution of content. Now that power is in the hand of Facebook or Google, And you can actually see the ways in which newspaper advertising revenues have gone through the floor. Google ad sales have gone through the roof. The problem, of course, is that Google doesn't actually pay for reporting, which means we're losing out on that sort of critical information. A lot of my work is on sort of these next two slides. There's a lot of ways that people come in and hack the system. They use automated accounts or bots to make things popular. They insert disinformation into the system. They use trolling or harassment to try to silence people. And then even beyond that, it's possible that these systems, just as they are, have all sorts of downsides. They lead to echo chambers where we only hear what we want to hear, where mobs end up sort of controlling conversations. It seems like this system is very, very vulnerable to conspiracy theories. So I do think there's lots to be worried about when we think about a shift from a print and broadcast era into an internet era. What I always have to remind people, though, is that some of the shifts that we're worrying about, these shifts towards polarization, these shifts towards extremism, they were happening well before the internet. So we've got to figure out what we actually want to solve when we look at internet age problems versus what are just much larger shifts going on in politics in the US and sort of more broadly around the world.
Great. Well, thanks, Ethan. And I should say to students, if you want to ask a question, just put it in the chat box. And what I'm going to do is I'll ask Ethan a couple more questions, kind of framing questions, and then we'll get to the questions that we've got in the chat box. So the second question, Ethan, is so the assignment for this week for the students is have the technological advances of the last 20 years improved or damaged the public's ability to deliberate about public policy? And you've touched a bit on that already, but how would you address that question? And I'm totally open to the possibility it's the wrong question to ask too. So I'll pass it over to you.
No, I think it's a great question. So I want to even sort of back up a little bit and give a riff that I tend to teach in most of my classes, but I'm probably only going to see y'all once. So let's talk briefly about the post office. There's a really good argument that the post office is the most important institution historically in the United States. In 1830, 85% of employees of the US government are employed by the post office. So in the early 1800s, the United States is basically a post office system with a small bureaucracy and a tiny army attached to it. And this is by design. You see Ben Franklin pushing for the post office to be central to the foundation of a new country. You see legislation in 1792, the Post Office Act, that establishes all sorts of rules that seem really surprising. For most of the 19th century, the postal system is basically designed to do one thing, which is carry newspapers around the United States. And so in the US, even around 1800, you're averaging more than one newspaper subscription per household. So why is this? Like, why is this going on? The answer is the framers of the United States understand that there's no way to have a democracy, no way to have public discourse without having a public sphere of one fashion or another. And the US is vast. It's much, much bigger than any of the European nations. You have to connect people from Boston down to Charleston, South Carolina. And the only way to imagine doing this in the late 1700s is through newspapers and letters and the ability to pass these things around this vast, vast nation. So what happens in 1792 is this crazy cross subsidy, right? You have a postal system where if I want to send a letter to Al, that's incredibly expensive, right? It's the kind of thing that you might do like 2 or 3 times a year because it costs so much money. But that first-class mail is used to subsidize making newspapers incredibly cheap to move around. Newspapers are free for one newspaper to send to another. They're allowed to send exchange copies. So if I publish a newspaper in Pittsfield, I can send it freely down to South Carolina, and that news will sort of spread down there. What this ends up creating is a public sphere of print. And we need to understand it's a weird public sphere, right? It's really political. It's filled with mis and disinformation. These are party newspapers. They're highly partisan, right? So this is an angry, disputatious space, but this is what the framers of the United States create. And it's pretty unique in the world at that point. And they do it at incredible, incredible cost. So you can argue in many ways that the United States as we know it emerges from this postal system and the subsidy associated with it. So we have always been a nation based around the idea of creating a public sphere where we can argue and go back and forth with one another. In that sense, where we are right now with the internet is pretty darn similar, right? It's filled with mis and disinformation. It's highly disputatious, but it's extremely accessible. And I would argue in many ways, what happened in, say, the late 20th century, where we had this sort of more moderated public sphere, we had very respectable broadcasters who would say very respectable things to us. That was the exception to the rule. This sort of no holds barred, crazy public space is actually much more traditionally what politics in the US has been all about. Now the question sort of becomes, can we handle it? Can we actually interact with this space? And how do we think about the health of our discourse associated with it? So Orion's question, how could the post office be considered more important than Congress and the presidency? Certainly for the 18th and the 19th century, they're a much bigger percentage of government. And certainly in terms of impact on most individuals, arguably they have a much bigger effect. The post office is actually what leads to the expansion of roads. It leads to the expansion of railroads. It leads to the expansion of air routes within the 20th century. So I'm saying it in part to be provocative, but not entirely to be provocative. I would go further and say that Congress and the presidency both emerge very much out of that fertile public sphere of print, where people are arguing about the Constitution instead of arguing about where the nation starts from.
Basically,
So,
it's the only medium that politics can happen through, right? Over a distance. That's the only way of right now.
No, but so Al, let's turn this back to you because you are more of an expert on politics in a broadcast era. What I'm arguing is that broadcast is actually kind of the exception to the rule. There's probably, 100 years, it's even less than 100 years because radio doesn't hit in a big way until 1920. It's really about 80 years where the broadcast era is kind of how politics is done. And then there's a shift, and I'm arguing that it's a shift back rather than a shift forward to this really disputatious, participatory public sphere. What do you feel like is changing with that shift going on?
Well, that's interesting because then, the argument would be, as you say, that the unusual period is actually the period of broadcast, which starts roughly in the early 1920s and starts to die out in the 1990s. And that
let's call 2000 as a rough year for the shift.
And that it starts really at peak in the 30s with the advent of radio and then television. But then the argument would be that the norm is actually this kind of highly decentralized, as you say, highly politicized, disputatious modes of political communication. The interesting thing is, just going back to what you were saying about trust, is that the peak period for trust appears to be the 50s and the 60s.
That's right.
But that implies that it's correlated also, and this may just be coincidental, it's correlated with that moment in which broadcast media is dominant. So maybe the American reality is actually highly decentralized communication, disputation, polarization. It's all tied together, and low trust. And actually, we're kind of benchmarking off the anomalous period.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one possible theory. Like, one possible theory is that maybe we're actually at pretty low trust during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Certainly, it's hard to imagine Herbert Hoover having enjoyed a great deal of trust. The flip side to it essentially says one of the things that's happened at the same time as the internet and participatory politics and this digital public sphere have grown is that levels of education have grown. We have vastly more people now completing high school, going to college, going into graduate education. The critical thinking skills that are very much what you and I hope to teach, very much what people are picking up in a university education, those start to get more evenly distributed in the population. And another possibility for what shifts at the same time as the internet, at the same time as sort of the decline of broadcast, is that we're seeing this sort of vast increase in the baseline level of education and people's ability to be sort of critical about this. Just to sort of respond to a couple of things that have come up in the chat. Yes, absolutely. In fact, in the 17 and 1800s, first class mail is a massive luxury. You might get one piece of mail a year, and it's usually Uncle Joe died and left you his farm, right? Like, that's the level of communication you might get. Newspapers, on the other hand, cost about a tenth as much to send. A pretty common practice in the 1800s is if you want to send a letter home, you actually take the newspaper, you poke holes with a pin under the words that you want to say. And people know to read the newspaper by like holding it up to the light of the fire and see where those pinholes are. And that's how you get a message across cheaply. But the reason this gets constructed is to have that public sphere of print. Why I'm arguing that this is a strange period is that what we see for a good chunk of the 20th century is this idea that the news should be neutral, right? It shouldn't take a political stand. It should try very, very hard to be right down the middle and acceptable to both the left and the right. That really comes into play in like the 1910s, the 1920s, with newspapers that decide that they want to reach both left and right-wing audiences. All through the 1700s, the 1800s, the press looks a little bit more like Fox News versus MSNBC. It's highly partisan, it's highly political. So Al and I are sort of speculating that the later 20th century, right, this sort of broadcast era, that might be kind of like an 80-year exception in the history of the United States and the history of US politics.
So could I maybe ask Ethan how you see this debate recently about things like filter bubbles and echo chambers and concerns about hate speech and fake news. And the readings we got for today sort of had different takes on this. One basically saying it's overwrought, another one saying, it's actually a serious problem. When you follow this debate, how much do you worry about the corrosion or the decay of public deliberation?
So the guy who sort of popularizes the idea of the filter bubble is my friend Eli Pariser. And he and I argue about this a lot. And Eli's take on this is he's really worried that even though he's pretty far politically to the left, he wants to hear opinions from all sides. And he finds that even when he ends up following people who lean to the right on Facebook, Facebook gives him less of those posts. It seems to be pushing him towards views that are comfortable and familiar. And this is something that is potentially very, very different from this era of print deliberation. In print deliberation, maybe you subscribe to a left-wing newspaper, but someone else in town is subscribed to a right-wing newspaper, and you're probably sharing those at the general store or the coffee shop or something like that, and you're encountering other people who you're deliberating with. What if the internet is actually wiring it so that you're not getting other political points of view? One of the things that's really tough about this is we just don't really know if this is true. A lot of people went out and tried to replicate Eli's sort of ad hoc experiments, and largely, failed to do so. It turns out that Google actually doesn't customize your search results very much. But this is kind of a raging question within sort of internet and the social sciences. Are we in fact getting more polarized? One answer is that absolutely, we certainly could be. It's pretty easy to isolate yourself in points of view that only follow your own point of view. The trick is, a lot of us feel like that's probably not happening. I'm still connected to people that I went to high school with in the late 1980s. And a lot of them have become Republicans. And even if that's fairly far from where my own politics is, I see them on Facebook. And therefore, I'm seeing some arguments, some different points of view than I might otherwise be seeing. So this is part of what's so hard about this moment in studying the internet. We have a lot of theories. We have a lot of anecdotes. We have, interesting journalists like Kevin Roose going out there and saying, look, I am finding these people who started watching videos on YouTube who became white nationalists. They're falling down rabbit holes. As a social scientist, I look at this and go, that's really interesting. Is that 1 in a million? Is that 1 in 1,000? Is that 1 in 10? Those are really different numbers. And that we don't have a lot of clarity on right now. So I think the filter bubble and trying to figure out how we respond to it is really worthwhile. But I also think we need to start doing some of this really rigorous research and finding out how common this stuff is. Al, you are getting great questions in the chat here. Do you want to forward some of those? Because it's getting to the point where I'm not sure that I can just respond to all of them. You may have to do a little bit of hand-holding there.
Keeping a track on this. I think maybe what I'd like to do is move to, and it sort of riffs off the last question. Claire had a question a while back. Basically, it goes to the question of what do we do about it? If there's a problem, what do we do about it? And so part of the thing is we're debating about whether there is really a problem, how big it is. And I think Claire was, actually Claire, can you, pardon me, unmute? You want to just sort of ask the question yourself?
Sure. My question had to do with Facebook and Twitter and other organizations stepping in and regulating that conversation that's happening on their platforms. So I know I'm blanking on the name of the body, but I think it was Facebook or Twitter or both created a new body of people to regulate tweets. Yep. I don't remember if I think they're separate, but I remember Twitter specifically because then they would flag certain tweets as promoting violence or disseminating false information. And I think it's really interesting because what ended up happening is them putting those tags on tweets from the president.
That's right.
So what is the role of those organizations then stepping in and deciding, no, the president just said something that's promoting violence, which they put on one of his tweets. And so when you go to see his tweet, you can't see the tweet because it says this has been flagged. So with that shift, we're seeing more power into these organizations and those bodies.
That's right.
That are entering politics in a way that is really interesting and becoming really influential. So I'd like to know what you think about that. And then that goes into, I think it was yesterday, Facebook banned 2 accounts that were seen as Russian proxy accounts, yep, trying to influence public opinion. So they're really influencing politics if they do something or if they don't do something. So
right. So let's dig into this a little bit, because I think this is exactly this sort of wicked problem that I know that Al is trying to teach in this class. So on the one hand, platforms like Facebook or Twitter make it easy for almost anybody to share opinions, and those opinions could potentially go out to hundreds of millions of people. The flip side is that people sometimes share opinions that end up being really dangerous. So let's dig in for a moment on public health information, right? there's a group of people in the United States who sincerely believe that coronavirus is a hoax, who believe that masks are dangerous, and who believe that Bill Gates is going to try to implant tracking chips in us when we're all vaccinated. I don't think there's any reason to believe that those things are true, but there are people who want to go out and say those things. You can argue from a First Amendment standpoint that everybody should have a right to say whatever they want. The trick is the First Amendment applies to the government putting barriers to speech, right? These platforms are private spaces. And when you join them, you sign up to a terms of service that is almost always written to give these platforms immense amounts of discretion. I wrote one of the first terms of service for one of the first social media companies in the late 1990s. And the way that I wrote it essentially says, I reserve the right to do whatever the heck I want. This is my house. You're welcome here, but if you break any of the rules, I'm going to throw you out. And at the end of the day, that's what Facebook, Twitter, everybody else ends up saying. So they have the right to suppress your speech. At the same time, if they do it in ways that's arbitrary or capricious, over time their users sort of rebel. So they are balancing this sense of we want to encourage speech with this notion of public harm, right? If the pandemic video in which Judy Minkowitz tells us that wearing a mask is dangerous, you shouldn't do it, maybe that's harmful. Maybe that actually makes the pandemic worse. And so platforms say that's potentially dangerous. We're going to pull that down. You end up in this really interesting tension between public health and free speech. This is the sort of tension that governments are used to, right? Governments try to figure out, hey, should it be okay for you not to vaccinate your kid for religious reasons, or is that dangerous? And so governments work and try to find a solution to it. We're asking Facebook, Twitter, and all these other platforms essentially to step up and be governments. And I'll tell you, they hate it. They really don't want to be in that situation because no one likes them. Like, people end up really unhappy with it. I spend a lot of time talking to folks within Twitter and within Facebook. In some ways, they are really hoping for regulation to kind of help them through this. But it's a wicked problem because there's so many actors in there. How do you deal with the people who sincerely believe something that may be harmful to spread in one fashion or another? What the platforms have done in many ways is pretty minimal. It's fairly rare that they take people down. And when they do, it's not for speech. It's for reasons like they're misrepresenting who they are on their account. Even with the president inciting violence, they leave the tweet up there. They put a warning in front of it, but that's as far as they're sort of willing to go. And largely, it's because we have not figured out how to have these debates as a society, how to have these debates as government. We're sort of outsourcing this to Facebook or Twitter, who really don't want to be put in that decision-making role, but who are in that role at present.
Ethan, Patrick's actually got a question. He's asking about the role of independent journalists and whether they can make things better. And actually, let me kind of roll in a kind of similar question. You know, we're talking right now about the possibility of government regulation and whether it might make things better. We were talking a couple of weeks ago about different instruments or tools of government. Regulation is one tool. I mean, basically what government did through the post office was a massive subsidy to the newspaper industry, right? Basically a financial assistance to basically keep that industry, to make it go. Is there something government can do today to basically financially support actors who can make the environment better? Is there some way to encourage kind of neutral, independent, better journalism?
So I do think that journalism has to have a key role in all of this, right? So I spend a lot of my time studying the internet in developing nations. And one of the things that's gotten really scary in a lot of countries is the role of WhatsApp in spreading mis or disinformation. WhatsApp is particularly challenging because it's an encrypted platform, right? I can't look from the outside and say, oh no, people are spreading mis or disinformation. All I see is a lot of people using WhatsApp. Journalists in Mexico started a project called Verificado, and 100 newsrooms throughout Mexico partnered to fact check rumors that came up in WhatsApp. So something would come up in WhatsApp, someone would accuse a particular political candidate of being a drug dealer, and someone in the WhatsApp would forward it onto this team of journalists. And those journalists would research, they would come up with, hey, we looked into this, here's what we think is really happening. And then it would get published across 100 different newspapers in Mexico. Incredibly effective, incredibly powerful, and a way in which participatory media, with people sort of flagging things to pay attention to, could interact with journalism. The trick is, this is a really rough moment for journalism. The business models for most journalistic organizations really are not working very well. For me, I actually think a big part is that we probably need significant subsidies for journalism, for high quality journalism. That's what happens in most of Europe. It happens in Canada. It happens in a whole lot of developing nations where we have very strong public media. Public media doesn't mean government media. It means an independent body that's using some taxpayer dollars to create high quality journalism. In the US, we tend to be pretty fearful about this. And we tend to worry that this is going to have a particular political point of view associated with it. One of the crazier ideas that I'm working on, it's actually what I'm coming to UMass to work on, is this idea that you might want to apply the public media model to building new social media spaces. You might have spaces that work alongside Facebook or Twitter that have a logic where maybe what they do is promote high quality information. Maybe they encourage conversation between people who often disagree with one another. And maybe you actually use taxpayer money to try to subsidize those things. So one of the reasons I tell the post office story is that it's a story about a moment in time in America where we made a decision to use money to sort of subsidize the creation of a particular kind of media. I actually think we should probably continue thinking about that, because right now we're seeing shrinkage within journalism, and that's potentially incredibly dangerous for an open society.
You know, just as we're talking about the post office, I mean, one of the things that came up, because that's the main channel of communication, and this is pre-Civil War, one of the hot button, well, the hot issue at the time is slavery, and one of the critical questions becomes the fact that Northern abolitionists are using the mails to send anti-slavery material to Southern states. Yep. And one of the challenges that postmasters in Southern states start basically trying to regulate the flow of traffic, you know, abolitionist newspapers, abolitionist correspondence, sort of comparable debate in that period, I guess.
Not to mention Black-owned newspapers, right? So one of the really interesting things that's happening in the early 1800s is that you start seeing an independent Black press in the North starting to come up from former slaves who've sort of moved up there. One of the interesting things is that Franklin, in like the 1760s, anticipates this, maybe even the 1750s. He's one of the biggest printers in Philadelphia. He realizes that if the Post won't carry his newspapers because they don't like the politics of it, then he's screwed. He can't make money as a printer, right? His money comes from those newspaper subscriptions, sending them out to people. And so he ends up with what we would now call network neutrality. He basically becomes postmaster on this platform of, I'm going to carry everything without fear or favor. I am going to allow the Post to carry material whether we like it or not. And absolutely, that's something that ends up being extremely threatening to the South as abolitionist literature is going through there. But there is this tradition going back to the origins of the colonial post. This is the post that's still being overseen by Britain. It is neutral, and it has to be neutral as a way of supporting first revolution and then later abolition. So this notion of Facebook should be neutral, Twitter should be neutral, the roots of that go really, really, really deep. But now we're having this very reasonable pushback where people are saying, look, if you are a woman on Twitter who is being harassed every day, you are going to be silenced. Your ability to speak is being adversely affected by someone else's speech. And that's a space in which we have to consider conflicting rights and responsibilities. What's really hard about this is that these things were set up as businesses. They weren't set up as political systems. They weren't set up as courts. Claire before made reference to the Facebook Advisory Board. This is a group of very, very smart tech experts and lawyers from around the world. They're going to get called in as sort of a court of appeals on major speech issues. So if there's a conflict again over are people inciting genocide in Myanmar using Facebook, this body is going to get called in to sort of adjudicate that. This is a move, a recognition that these platforms have really serious political implications and that some of these institutions need to be in place.
Ethan, Jack, I'm getting a bit of an echo, but Jack asks a question about corporate control, which is really a thing I don't think we've touched on yet. Back in the heyday of so-called mainstream media, corporate control was always a big question. Is corporate control something we still need to worry about, even if we're in this new decentralized environment? Corporate control over the kinds of messages that get disseminated?
So I think the classic argument that, you know, a small number of corporations control all the media, I think that was an argument that probably had a lot more currency in the 1980s and 1990s, the sort of McChesney argument. I think there's a lot more space for new networks and new companies to sort of get voices out there. You know, the flip side is when voices get popular, there does tend to be a convergence, right? I sort of came up during the decade of blogging, where a lot of people managed to be really influential just by writing on their own websites. Almost all those people have now been hired by the New York Times or the Atlantic or Salon or somebody. And therefore, there's a lot more centralization of that opinion. But at the same time, if you think about the people who are really influential right now, it's not the writers, it's the YouTubers. It's people who have YouTube channels and are getting millions or tens of millions of people paying attention to them. It's podcasters. And yeah, there's corporations in that space, but they tend to be new corporations. And this tends to be driven in some ways by highly influential individuals. So I actually think it's, and someone just pointed out that TikTok is increasingly becoming a place where people start having influence. I think it's just a very different dynamic. We had a point where corporations controlled the production, the making of the news, the distribution, the access to the airwaves, the advertising associated with it. It's now really distributed. You have individuals like Joe Rogan, and yep, absolutely signed a deal with Spotify, but Joe Rogan was really the powerful person in that equation, right? And Joe Rogan's not a corporation. He's an individual who's managed to have a lot of power. I see many more people like that rather than sort of looking at this and saying General Electric dominates the media landscape. No, I mean, not even Disney at this point really dominates in the way that it did even 20 or so years ago.
So we're going to, I'd like to pitch one more question, and then we're going to run a couple minutes overtime, folks, but it won't be too much past the 11 o'clock mark. And it goes to a question that Venezianos, and I apologize if I've got the name wrong, asked earlier on. And let me kind of put a gloss on it. Technology moves really fast. It changes very quickly, and the knock against government is that it moves very slowly. And sometimes that means that, you know, the complaint is that by the time government gets around to doing some kind of policy intervention, the problem has morphed or changed. So what do you think? Venezianos basically asked about, how about just going with the Wild West approach? You know, just,
Yeah.
this isn't quite what he says, but
Yeah.
let it
Yeah.
go and it'll fix
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah. So, so first of all, I think that's right. I spent a lot of my career at a place called the Berkman Klein Center, which is one of the kind of leading groups that tries to figure out public policy and regulation on the internet. And the rule there is basically that Congress is a minimum of 7 years and usually closer to 10 years behind what's actually happening on the internet. And because the internet moves so quickly, it can feel almost like we're solving problems from a different generation. I think that's why people pressure the platforms so much. They're hoping the platforms will make a decision more quickly than Congress, for instance, might end up making a decision. And I think there's a case for it. In many ways, I want to argue for trying to build new systems that do what we want them to do, rather than trying to regulate our way towards the future. My work very much is on trying to create new social media spaces whose users govern them. So rather than having Facebook with this opaque terms of service telling us what's allowed, we actually act as a governing body of our own spaces, and we decide what's allowable in our spaces, and we enforce our own speech codes. And for me, I think that's a much healthier way to go. I actually think we know a lot what a Wild West internet looks like. Go spend some time on 8kun. They really pride themselves on not having any rules of the road. And you'll find it's not a super pleasant place to hang out. It can be a very interesting place to hang out, but you don't want to hold certain types of conversations there. I think what we probably need is a real breadth of spaces. I often argue that, you know, we have lots of public spaces in the world. We have libraries, we have churches, we have pool halls. You'd never want a world with only one of those things, right? And it's hard to, you know, shoot pool in a church, just like it's hard, you know, to read in a pool hall. So a number of people are saying that 4chan is terrible. And yeah, it is. 8kun's even worse. But it's actually an interesting space for certain conversations. It's just not one that I would choose to be in all that often. But I also don't want to be in a world where there's only one space, you know, whether it's Facebook or whether it's Twitter. I really think we want a world with thousands of different kinds of public spaces that all have different affordances and different norms, right? 4chan is terrible both because of affordances and norms, right? The affordances are everything's anonymous. No one has a username. It's transient. Everything disappears. Those are all technical aspects of it. The norms are part of why it's terrible. Everybody insults one another all the time. Everyone uses racist and sexist language all the time. That's not the law. Those are the norms that go with it. We need to think about how we create online spaces for discourse, for civil discourse, that have the affordances and the norms that we want to have discussions about public policy and everything else about.
Great. Am I on? Great. That's a great way to note on which to end the discussion, because that's exactly the question we're looking at this week. Ethan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
It's my pleasure, and it's great to meet all of you. This is an incredible series of questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I hope we at least scratched the surface of some of them.
Yeah, and I'd like to say thanks to everybody who joined in today for these. These have been fantastic questions. And so everybody, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you again on Monday. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Zuckerman.
Thank you.
You got a fun class there.
Yeah, those are great questions.
Yeah, absolutely. That was good fun.
Let me figure out how to stop recording. Okay.